So, Professor Adam Hart, thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while because before I even picked up your book, I just had this feeling that something wasn't right. There's all these underlying tensions within us that make at least me, and I'm sure those listening, feel like we're just not equipped for the world that we currently find ourselves in. And so, before we dive into some of the specifics, what are the biggest factors from evolution that are causing that feeling that I have that I'm just disconnected from where I should be?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question, isn't it? And I think you're right. I mean, let's look at my situation right now. Right, I'm sat very safe in a dry house. My children are being educated at a school that's just next door to me. I've just driven to the shops, didn't have to go out and slaughter anything or pick or grow anything, and it's all very, very convenient. And yet, in the back of my mind at the moment, there's these things going around, there's these pressures and tensions and stuff. We live in this very comfortable world that really should be an absolute paradise, and yet you're right, there is an unease. That's a really nice way of putting it, actually. Sort of there's an uneasy tension with that. What is it about our evolutionary past that brings that about? Well, I mean, very simply, I suppose, the world that we evolved to be in, and we are very well adapted animals for the world around us. But that world has changed, and the thing is, it's changed incredibly abruptly. So, 200 years ago, nobody was worrying about social media. Someone could have invaded another country and we wouldn't know about it for another week. And then, it wouldn't be directly affecting us because it was thousands of miles away, to use a sort of a recent story. We have constant woes that come about from the structures that we produce because we have to pay taxes and we have to find money and we have to have shelter and all these sorts of things. So the modern world has provided this kind of comfort blanket in a way, but that comes with a price, and that price is often enhanced stress, information overload, and everything else. And I think those things sort of pile onto us, and our brains are not really wired to deal with thousands of people. They're not, we are very immediate creatures. Evolution isn't a planning thing. We're evolved to take care of what's in front of us and put the fire out now. We're not great at planning, actually, and you can see that in a great deal of what we do. We're very, very good at sorting out ourselves and the people immediately around us right now. Anything else takes a considerable amount more effort. So I think all of those things kind of lumped together, and most of the time we function pretty well, of course. Most of the time we blunder our way through, but I think a lot of people are finding increasingly now that some of those pressures and tensions and things are starting to pile up for them, and we don't necessarily have the tools to overcome them. We need to work to overcome them, and we need to think about how we can make ourselves better.
And so I hear you say about 200 years ago things were very different, which is, of course, a tiny amount of time in the scale of evolution. Are you able to trace back roughly when it was that society and the modern world kind of overtook what we were prepared to deal with? Is there a point in history where it turns?
I think there is, and it's a point that happens at several different points across the world. But probably the biggest thing that's occurred to us in our social history was the development of agriculture, because that allowed us to develop from relatively simple, quite small communities and societies that would have been mostly involved in hunter gathering and so on, and didn't need to do too much planning, and really wasn't involved in building cities, states, and all of that sort of stuff, and all the politics and society that comes with it. Having agriculture develop sort of 12 to 15,000 years ago, although it varies throughout the world, that was a very, very big step in developing what we would think of as the modern world. And you can see the development of that. We kick off then, really. And and suddenly we find ourselves among the sort of ancient Greeks and the Romans fairly quickly, and all the other civilizations that we know about. And then, of course, we go through into sort of the Industrial Revolution, which was the next big revolution in terms of how we organized ourselves. And that allowed us to develop even further into what we would think of as a modern state. You know, probably in many respects not that different from what we see now in terms of the big issues. And then, of course, there's this third revolution, which is the information revolution, and that has happened incredibly quickly. Really, I think it's probably fair to say the last 20 years, really. I mean, 1994 was the sort of often taken as the date of the development of the internet and so on. That's what, 30 years ago or so, 35 years ago, whatever it is. My maths gets a bit sketchy towards the beginning of the year. What is it? Yeah, it's about 30 odd years ago, isn't it? Um, that's really the modern world as we know it now has really taken shape over the last few decades. But of course, it's had these other revolutions before. So yeah, we're really talking about a sort of transition of perhaps 10,000 years, and then sort of 2 to 300 years, and then and then it's collapsed even further into 2 or 3 decades, and it's that pace of development is very difficult for us to take account of.
So I was born in 1995, so after the wide adoption of the internet. And so to lead into my next question, this is an interesting tightrope that I walk in, as much as evidently much of what I do is evolved, right? But then I've grown up in a world where this third wave of kind of environmental changes exists. I feel like I'm in control. I feel like the decisions I make are logical and I'm quite lucid. But how much of that is actually true? How much of our actions are genuinely free will, and how much of it is just some kind of root deep within us that's guiding us to act and say and think in certain ways?
Yeah, I mean that's a really big question, sort of philosophically, practically, but now, of course, it's become a really important question from a societal perspective because I suppose in one aspect of free will, I suppose it's fairly trivial. So, for example, we think we're free to do what we want, but I drove to the shops earlier and I drove on the left-hand side and I stuck to the road. I could have driven across the field. I could have driven on the other side of the road. There was, I had free will, I suppose, but of course that free will wasn't really being exercised. And I went into the shop, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't necessarily want to pay for the goods, but I did, right? Because that's the way it works. So I think quite a lot of our everyday things we think we're making decisions and choices, but we're not. We're kind of being, if you like, driven along a certain route. But more subtly than that, we've seen recently, certainly in the past 5 years, and yeah, arguably in the last few even more, the influence of misinformation and fake information in terms of how we think. So again, we think that we're free to think the way that we are, but in fact we're not, and we know that algorithms exist that can manipulate the way we think very, very easily. And that is a scary development. The information revolution is a phenomenal thing, right? It's an amazing time to be alive in terms of gaining information, but it allows those tools to exist that allow more manipulation of the way people think. And we've seen that with the COVID conspiracy theories. We've seen it with sort of fake information, foreign powers using fake information to manipulate votes. I mean, it now seems to be beyond question that there was Russian engagement in the Brexit vote, for example. We know that there's been engagement in the same way in the US, and that's more scary because people that think those things will think that they think those things because they're thinking sentient human beings that are capable of rational thought and free will, and they've taken all the information in and they've made their own decision, and they've been played like a fiddle. Because we now know enough about people and the way they are and how to push their buttons that we can make it seem like it's a free choice, and it's not. And that's quite scary. And that, of course, latches into all kinds of evolutionary adaptations that we have. We want to belong. We have this in-group, out-group thing. All of the sort of societal, all of our intellectual structures that have evolved for us to be able to live in societies can, in the right situation, perhaps be used against us. And I guess that's an aspect of the modern world that's quite scary. Yeah, fake information and stuff isn't new. Um, as soon as people were printing things, they were. I mean, people have been telling lies for a long time, right? But what's new is the ability to be able to tailor it so specifically and to reach so many people in such a nuanced way with big data. And that comes about because we invented computers, and that's another adaptation, right? Our massive brains and fabulous hands, they're the things that get us into trouble time and time again.
So, given that evolution happens so slowly, and yet these algorithms and these entities with ill intent move so quickly, do you think that the trajectory we're on with things such as fake news, we'll dive into that more later, but just more generally being able to kind of hack, for want of a better word, the human condition through science, is that reversible, or are we just stuck on this path now because we will never evolve our way out of it?
We're not going to evolve our way out of this. No. Evolution requires variation, and there's plenty of variation in the human intellect, but it also requires that variation to be linked to reproductive advantage and for offspring to be more able to profit more in that environment than others, and that's just not the world that we live in now. So no, we're not going to evolve our way out of it, unfortunately. But we have the tools, right? We have the intellectual tools to be able to think our way out of it, which I suppose is a product of our evolution. What we don't have currently are necessarily the mechanisms to get those tools working, and I think yeah, we see it a lot. We see people who simply can't think critically, and that's not a fault. I mean, well, I suppose it is a fault, but it's not their fault. It's a fault perhaps of education and the way that we think about things. I saw someone whose intellect I admire greatly, a philosophy PhD, and very deep thinker, sort of posting on Twitter the other day saying, "I think I've inadvertently shared some fake information over the last couple of days. I've been looking back over what I've been saying, and I don't think it's true now." That's the other problem with the world now, right? We're all shooting from the hip all the time. People want their opinion and right now, and now it's recorded, so whatever you say is down there, and then it gets propagated, and that's a very that's a very different world from sitting down in front of a campfire and sort of discussing ideas. I mean, that's one of the things that I think we've lost to a certain extent. I see it with student groups when we go away on field trips and things. People are more reticent to sit and share their opinions because suddenly everyone's jumping on them. When I was in my 20s, you could sit down and have a few drinks and talk total nonsense, and people would challenge you with it, and you'd have stand-up rows with friends and stuff, and you'd all be mates at the end of it. No one was recording it or posting it. No one was judging you or cancelling you or anything else, and that's how you would form opinions. Now, we've to a certain extent lost that, or when people try to do that through social media and so on, that opinion forming itself becomes problematic. And I think we're in this kind of stage where developing critical thought is difficult, but we've we've never needed it more than we do now, right? The world's never been a more complex place, I guess, than it is right now. So yeah, we need to think our way out of it. Unfortunately, evolution is not going to help us out this time.
So just a final bit of context setting, and I want to return to that tightrope that I've been walking between obvious evolution and the environment I've grown up in. Because in preparing for this conversation, I did, as is the case with every guest, the most basic of research and then just rely on you to carry it. I've been reading about the difference between evolution and environment and how the scientific world is able to discern the difference between, okay, this is a trait which has evolved through XYZ, whereas this is just a cluster of people who are responding quite immediately to their environment. How does science discern between the two?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of question that becomes much easier when you're dealing with non-human subjects, partly because the questions are usually simpler, but also because you can do more experiments. But fundamentally, evolution is a genetic process. Evolution is simply the change in genetic frequency over time. So when you're talking about evolved qualities, what you mean is that those traits have come about as a consequence of a genetic foundation that has then been selected for through generations to have some advantage to the individuals that have that particular genetic makeup, and of course they pass that on to their offspring, who pass it on to their offspring, and fairly soon, sometimes actually quite dramatically in some experimental systems, you can end up with everyone or every individual having that quality. So scientifically, evolution is a very well-defined process that is inherently genetic. Of course, what you can have in human societies is much more complex behaviors and behaviors that aren't. So, for example, I mean, language is a good one, right? We're talking in English. It's my native language. I assume it's yours, but it may not be. But lots of other people around the world, of course, don't speak in English as their native language. They speak in all kinds of other languages. And I was in Namibia recently, and the people there that I was talking to speak a language that has lots of clicks in it. So they have this kind of sound, but they don't just have that. They have several different clicks that mean different things, and we had lots of fun with various trying to say various words. Language is a trait that's shared environmentally by people that now less so in a more mixed world, but grew up and developed that language together. However, the ability to be able to have language and the ability to be able to speak and the mental ability to be able to pass that language on, of course, is an evolved trait. So we have this interesting thing where we have, language as a sort of module is evolved, but the software that goes into it is cultural. So there can be these interesting mixes. But yeah, fundamentally, when we're talking about something being evolved, we absolutely assume and often haven't proved that there is a genetic underpinning to it.
Something else I came across in my research in niche corners of the internet were those who,
Always the
for
interesting
whether it's
corners.
ideologic, all of it, whether it's through religion or ideology, there are naturally those who don't believe in evolution. They dismiss it. How have we got to a point where we have evolved ourselves to a certain degree that we can now have abstract thoughts to dismiss the evolution that allowed us to have those thoughts?
Yeah, I mean it's a brilliant thing, isn't it? I guess the first thing. Hang on, I'm just gonna have a quick cough. So I guess the first thing is evolution itself. So one of the biggest sort of criticisms you see thrown against it is, well, it's only a theory. That's because people don't understand the way that science uses the word theory. Theory in everyday use generally means something quite hazy and waffly, and usually a little bit kind of yeah, sketchy, right? Well, theoretically, we can put that fence up this afternoon, but probably not, right? It's that kind of sense. But actually, in science, what theory means is a really well evidenced set of observations and hypotheses that collectively form a very robust explanation for a particular phenomenon, right? So theory has a different meaning. So that's the first thing. I mean, and the second thing is there is such abundant evidence for evolution that it's pointless to even begin explaining it to people. But if they want, then simply we can look at the transmission of the SARS virus that causes COVID. We can look at antibiotic resistance. You know, these are everyday examples now of evolution in action. And then I guess the third point is that yeah, we have this fantastic capacity for abstract thought, which allows us to come up with staggering things. I mean, the human brain is unbelievable I mean, when you actually step back. It's kind of it's staggering to even get your head around your own head. Even having that conversation ends up in an afternoon shivering in the shed, right? Because you know, so yeah, if you put something in front of someone and say, right, this is I don't know, this is a mobile phone, and they'll look at it and go, no, it's not. And you can say, well, okay, I can prove to you that it's a mobile phone because look at how it functions and everything. And they'll go, no, I just don't believe it. And at that stage, you really have to. Well, you really have to wonder just what the limits of human, of sort of human abstract thought is, because we're able to internalize things that are completely untrue and believe them very, very solidly, just as we are able to internalize things that are manifestly true and believe them very solidly. And it's yeah, that is a very interesting component of our psyche. Lots of people have related that to an important social benefit. So, for example, believing what everyone else believes around you, our capacity for religious beliefs. Lots of people have sort of broken that down as a potentially evolutionary significant trait. It's something, you know, the architecture of our brain that allows for that actually provides advantages to people that believed that in the past and so on. So there are all these interesting kind of avenues you can go down. But of course, the problem is when you're talking about evolution and genetics and stuff, what people want is, well, so there's a gene for believing misinformation, or there's a gene for believing in a god or something, and it's like, well, no, that's not the way it works. You know, our brain is this fantastically complex architecture that's genetically underpinned, but you know, disentangling those sorts of things is very, very difficult. So we can come up with lots of speculative kind of ideas and lots of ideas that hold weight, but nailing it down to specific sort of genetics is currently not where we're at. But yeah, we're understanding more and more about the brain and how it develops and everything, you know, on a daily basis. So who knows where we'll be if we have this conversation in. I mean, people always say, you know, what in 5 years? In 5 years' time, we'll be having the same conversation. Where will we be in 500 years' time? You know, think about that sort of development of time. I mean, it'll be incredible.
Do you know why the brain evolved to imagine? This isn't something I plan to ask, and it might be a very big question. But I was thinking as you were talking there, it seems like a departure from any immediate utility, right? As in our imagination is so abstract that at least tangibly it doesn't seem like it gives us anything, and yet we all do it. So it's come from somewhere, right?
Well, I guess without imagination in its broadest sense, we're unable to plan. So I suppose, and we know that some animals even can have a planning for the future, and you know, presumably some internal representation of something. So the ability to be able to internalize the environment and imagine or think about what it might be if it were different enables you to then make a plan to make it different, which of course is a huge advantage if you're able to do it. If you can imagine that picking up a stone and hitting it against a flint produces a knife, and then you can imagine that or a blade. Let's not let's not over romanticize what those early tools were like. If you can then imagine that you could use that, suddenly you've got the ability to be able to give yourself an advantage. So I think I think you can see how the development of simple imagination or the development of some form of internalization could be really significant. Of course, the human brain is really run with that plan. More than more as far as we know, more than any other organism on the planet. Although, in my day job, one of the things I study is entomology and insects, and we're increasingly developing an understanding even of what their internal mental state might be like, and that might be more complex than we thought. Although, you know, it was explained to me as, look, they're not us, but they're not a toaster. That was the kind of, they've got something a little bit more about them than just a sort of a piece of machinery. But yeah, this idea of being able to internalize and being able to plan, yeah, it's definitely given us a huge advantage. But of course, gets us into all kinds of bother. We talk. I mentioned COVID earlier. I mean, I guess that's a consequence of our great brains and imagination, right? We love to talk, and we've developed a form of communication that involves, literally spitting in each other's faces, which is fabulous if you're a respiratory disease. And we developed through our wonderful imagination and fabulous ability to plan and these wonderful hands and everything else, the ability to be able to spread very rapidly around the world, which is perfect. I mean, if you were a respiratory virus infesting someone or infecting a species which spits in each other's faces and on a regular basis flies thousands of miles around the world to spit in other people's faces, I mean, it's pretty much perfect. So, our big brains and imaginations are wonderful, but do get us into trouble.
So something we all felt beginning of COVID around that time was a lot of stress, but stress is registered on different levels, and it kind of goes back to how we opened this conversation, that there are things which occur which are just a bit stressful on like a really deep underlying level because we can't quite explain them, right the way up to an inbox that's always full, or watching the news, for example, is another one. Particularly recently, an incredibly stressful experience just opening BBC News. Um, Given that stress is shown to make our judgment worse, to cause us to make bad decisions, and actually shortens our life, at what point in our history was stress a more useful utility, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, I mean, so stress really is a sort of an expression of the fight or flight response, which is our basic physiological response to immediate peril. And you can see this almost throughout the animal kingdom. Even I think mollusks even have some form of this as well. It's a very basal trait, and it's the ability to be able to amp things up very, very rapidly, and it's a wonderful thing. And we've all had that like sudden moment. It enables you to get out of a situation. It doesn't always. Sometimes it causes people to freeze and wet themselves and all kinds of other things. But in general, it can be a useful trait to get you out of trouble, and animals run away from predators and so on because of it. So that aspect of stress, our adrenaline response to it, which causes that physiological response, can be very, very useful. And evolutionarily, none of us would be here, I would imagine, if our ancestors weren't. I'm quite sure that, well, my grandfather and great grandfather were both sea captains on fishing boats. They both worked considerably before they had children. I'm fairly sure neither of them would have made it if they weren't able to deal with stressful situations immediately in front of them. We're very good at that stuff, but what we're not so good at is this constant drip of modern stresses. So things that evoke a very small quantity of that reaction nearly all the time, and that is where most people are putting their money, I think, on where sort of modern day stress is really causing the problem. And you're right, there are studies that show that it reduces health. I mean, it clearly is an unpleasant thing to live through, and it may well be reducing people's lifespan. It can cause heart issues and actual physiological changes. Those things are coming from this constant drip of stress, which we're not evolved for. The fight or flight response is a sudden, like, oh my god, let's get the hell out of here, and pump yourself full of something which is harmful and eventually will kill you. But it's really good in small measures, so don't worry about it, because you'll be fine, because that won't happen again for a few months, or at least a day or whatever. Whereas now we're like, Christ, another email's come in, and I've got this to do, and we're constantly in this kind of it's low level, right? We're not fighting tigers around every corner, but that low level dripping is causing that issue, and we're not built for that. And what's more, it, I mean, it's likely that, I suppose, probably as soon as we started getting together in groups, so some sort of stressors would have started to appear. But the modern world is saturated with it. It's there's a few issues, a few things in the book where I sort of talk about this idea. I mean, obesity and sort of drug addiction and stuff like that. But it's the modern world is so concentrated with things that aren't so good for us, and the rate at which they come at us is so furious compared to, sort of, if you like, a natural rate. It's that which we can't cope with individually. An email comes in, it's not a big deal, is it? Something happened. Most problems, actually, that we're constantly like about, if you just sit back and do them one at a time, they're not a big deal, right? Yeah, you got tax return to do. Well, just sit down and get it done, right? You've got this to do. Well, just have a break and get it done. The problem is we've always got, about a million things to do. And I mean, I've my car insurance is due, right? And I know I'm going to get, you know, thrashed on the price, but but it's like, it's never going to rise to the pile, because it's an acceptable level. But there's a little bit of stress in the back of me going, I'm overpaying for this. I should be sorting it out. Pointless. Right? Either I sort it out or I don't sort it out. But unfortunately, it's one of a whole load of other things that we don't sort out. But I'm not, about to fall out of a cliff top because I'm trying to hunt a bird on a branch. Right? It's not that form of stress, but it is the way that we live. And yeah, it's no good for us, right? And we know it's no good for us. I don't think there's anyone that's ever said, all this massively stressful life that we're living at the moment is amazing. There's a lot of kind of debate in the medical literature, and there's a lot of debate about, the extent of the damage it causes and the long-term damage and how different people deal with it, and worriers and warriors and all this stuff. But I've never seen anyone that says, it's a brilliant thing. Let's all make ourselves more frazzled. So yeah, I mean, this is something we're learning over the course of our the coming decades. How do we deal with this modern saturated life that we've made for ourselves?
Do you think that stress is relative? So if we take two things we've spoken about so far today, the first being the comfortable life you have of the house with the roof over your head and the shops just down the road, and the second being the fact that because you don't need to fight a tiger, do you think that we feel smaller stresses because we no longer have to face those bigger stresses, at least in day-to-day life?
Yes, I think we probably do. When there's a lot of triviality around us, we have a tendency to focus on the triviality, not because we like trivial things, but because that's what's all around us. Yeah, I mean, an example of that is I mean, used to, and now starting to again, go away, on trips as part of my job, and it's often to places like, South Africa or Namibia, and it's often quite an involved thing. When I'm there, I'm even though I might be looking after 30 students, or trying to deal with something else, or driving for, God knows how many miles across whatever, I'm generally as relaxed as I can be, even though actually the situation is potentially more stressful. And the reason why is because you've just got one thing to think about, the thing in front of you. What are you? I'm not worrying about whether or not I've renewed my, toaster warranty or whatever, because it's an irrelevance for what's in front of me right then. And so I think we do. We tend to focus on on the bright shiny things that are flashing in front of us. And computers and phones are great examples of that. Gambling machines, the same thing. We also get these little dopamine hits when we get involved with this stuff, or when we fix something small. So it counters that, right? And so we end up in this kind of strange sort of stress reward kind of territory about things that probably ultimately don't. I won't say they don't matter, right? They do matter, because that's the world we live in, and we've got to take care of these things. But we're not very good at balancing things up. And that's, probably again the way that our brains are set up, where we're good at fixing things that are in front of us, that are immediately important. Things that might happen in 6 months down the line that actually aren't that important. That tends not to be a priority, unless we've got nothing else to be thinking about.
So something else you speak about in the book is social media and how that is at odds with lots of what we've evolved to think and do and be. I'm going to be talking to Johan Hari in a couple of weeks, so this is a topic that I've been deep diving on, and he talks in his book Stolen Focus about how social media and the devices used by these social media companies to, for example, release dopamine and get us hooked, they draw down on the most absolute fundamental base levels of the human. What happened in evolution to build us in such a way where we are now so pre-exposed to be completely hijacked by 280 characters or some moving images on a phone?
Well, I mean, a few things. I mean, first of all, we're social creatures, and being social creatures means that we have developed both culturally, but also, evolutionarily, structures that allow us to get along with other people, and also to do more than that, to give us status with other people, to develop our own relationships with other people in ways that are beneficial to us, to develop the way that we see ourselves in relation to other people. And so we end up with a lot of things that psychologists sort of spend a lot of time studying, things like in groups and out groups, and you know sort of ego and personal status and all of this sort of stuff. So we have all of that in the background, but most of the time we're not having outlets for it all the time, unless you're a politician or something, in which case you're probably in that position because you're driven by perhaps an extreme need for it. But most of us, most of the time, we're not always playing political games or doing whatever, but if we need to, we can do, and we're all positioning ourselves. We're all slightly different forms of ourselves with different people and so on, right? So there's that in the background. And then the second thing, of course, is we've got sort of deep rooted in our brains, as you've just mentioned, these very basal kind of reward centers, right? That reward us for doing good things, which are things like having sex and eating good food and so on, because they're things that keep us alive. And people that do that, an animal, I mean, we're talking about people, organisms that do that have the same sort of receptors, right? Whether we're a lion or a human or a tamarin monkey or whatever, we have these dopamine receptors that reward us for good things. Now, when you start lumping all of that together with the ability at any given time to engage with these sorts of things and to get infuriated by it and to want to have status and to get everyone likes the likes, right? No one, again, no one goes onto Facebook and goes, "Oh, brilliant! I did a post and no one engaged with it." Wonderful. That's not the way it works. And so we have this kind of we want to for people to like what we do, and if they don't like it, we don't mind if there's a bit of a ruck behind it, right? Because we like to engage and be argumentative. That's a great way for us to develop arguments. But of course, it can get nastier when, I mean, I'm fairly active on social media, and I've had people say stuff to me on social media that they would never say to my face for no other reason than that's just not the way people behave, right? But so we've divorced ourselves from our facial signals and from our normal social cues, but we still have the same desires as before to have likes and to get involved and to sort of do all this sort of stuff. But we've taken away the safeguards, which is normally that, you've got two people standing in front of each other. They're generally not going to come to blows. But on Twitter and Facebook, they are essentially doing that because those safeguards are released. And of course, when people are going, oh yeah, go for it and liking all this stuff, you're getting all the dopamine release as well. So you've got this horrible kind of spiral. That's the first thing. The second thing is that it's easy, right? It's there all the time. It's we are social creatures, and many of us crave social interactions, and social interactions can be had at any given time. I picked up my phone casually just then, and I've got like 5 messages that have come in. you know, two people from overseas, someone else from London. It's cool stuff, right? If I wasn't talking to you, I'd be engaging with that, and I'd be really getting a hit from that because it's like they're asking me stuff, and I haven't seen this guy for a while, and things like that. So it gives us this phenomenal. I mean, it is an amazing thing that we can do this stuff. But and this is where the difficulties come in. Some people are not very well geared for it. Some people can cope with it, but some people can't. And that's actually what a lot of even the early studies showed, is that there are certain personality types and certain the ways that some people are set up that just mean that this is not a good way for them to be. And actually, I think probably the vast majority of people, everybody, whether they like to admit it or not, certainly the studies show that everybody feels better if they divorce themselves from social media for a bit. And that's what's been really interesting looking through, because I mean this hasn't been around for that long, right? Facebook started in like 2006 or something, and there were already studies not very long after it came out, like literally within that year there was a Dutch study or a Netherlands study that was sort of going, hang on a minute, maybe this isn't so good, and they were looking at the psychological effects of it, and so immediately it wasn't like it took us by surprise. We were immediately thinking, hang on a minute, we're not really geared for this. Now we're getting studies sort of talking about what happens if you take a social media break. I don't think that back in the day, in Stone Age times or whatever, people would be sat around a fire having a chat of an evening. And I don't think at some point they would have thought, yeah, I don't. I'm going to take a bit of a, I'm going to take a break from the campfire for it. Maybe they would have done, right, if things got a bit intense. But I think generally it's that saturation, right? It's that intensity that we have. It, if we want to, we can be there all the time, and we get these little rewards that make us want to, and that's the danger. It's relatively easy to stop doing it, actually, but for most people, but it's always that little. I'll just go on and see if I got any likes, and I think that's the danger. It rewards us, and it does so in a fairly small way, but it builds up.
A few years ago, actually, just before I started this podcast, the reason I eventually started this podcast back in like 2019 is because I took a month away from social media and I was looking to replace it with something. And the two lessons that I learned from that month away from social media, which back up anecdotally at least just how deep rooted it is first, the first few days of coming away from literally a couple of apps on a phone. I've never been in recovery from something like a drug addiction, but it wasn't far off how I've heard that described. It was so impulsive and constant, and I'd pick up my phone and scroll to a position where I knew the app was and it wasn't there. And then secondly, that kind of disconnect, that stress that I can't quite articulate, that I spoke of at the beginning, after maybe a week, just completely disappeared. So it's really interesting how that happens.
And that's a common experience, actually. That's what lots of people say when they've given it up, and they'll, so when you went back onto it, were you more controlled? Did you limit it? How have you re-immersed yourself in that world safely, or haven't you?
So I'll be honest, well, this is the thing. So maybe this just shows how powerful the devices that are used are. Because for the first few weeks, I would, let's say Twitter and Instagram, they're the two that seem to hook me the most. I'd open the apps and I'd be like, what am I on here for? I have no interest. It was almost like the pattern had broken and I had no interest in it. I'd open it, I'd be like, okay, I don't really care what anyone's saying. And yet, like a person who had never picked up a phone before, 3 or 4 weeks in, I was back to my old ways. My screen time would creep up, that stress would creep back in. And even sat here right now telling you that it's bad for me and that it's not the best use of time, I don't want to say I can't stop it, because if I really put the measures in, I could, but I don't have that burning desire within me to overcome the discomfort of stopping it. It's so interesting.
No, and I wonder whether that's because it's very it's actually very difficult to encapsulate either verbally or in any other way the harm it does in a way. So yeah, if you have a drug addiction, or you're an alcoholic or something, or addicted to cigarettes, right? You can put in real terms precisely the harm that you're both doing and then avoiding by not doing that activity. But I think it's much more difficult with social media, because you're right. There's that sense of, yeah, you feel less uneasy, and there's that sense, but it's very hard to intellectualize and put it down into something that makes sense. And I wonder if that is one of the issues. We know it's there, but we can't quite put our finger on it.
So just on this, I know in the book you speak a bit about addiction, and I know that people love to say, oh, it's just me, I have an addictive personality. Is there any truth in that? Have some of us evolved to be more pre-exposed to addiction?
Yeah, it seems that, I mean, some people have more of a tendency than others, but exposed to the right stimulus, anyone can be, because of those dopamine receptors and that's those sorts of pathways in the brain. But there is a natural variation in terms of how those receptors work in different people, which would give people some people more of a tendency than others. But and again, we come back to that idea of potency and concentration. We've been using drugs, for example, as a society for a very long time, but over the course of our social evolution, we have managed to concentrate natural substances into substances which are phenomenally powerful. So, I think I worked out in the book that you'd have to be chewing about 6 kilograms of coca leaves. I think it was something like that, sort of in about 5 seconds, to get the equivalent quantity of cocaine from a standard sort of dose of cocaine. So yeah, you're not going to be able to do it. Opium. People have been smoking opium sap for a long time. We've got records from Spain. From caves in Spain, I think from 6,000 years ago, maybe more. People have been smoking sort of cannabis for a very long time, and other plants. But now, of course, we've managed to convert opium sap into sort of morphine and diamorphine, heroin, and incredibly potent forms of that. We've got forms of cannabis now which have got levels of THC which are basically just pointlessly stupid. It's everything. It's our tendency to do this, right? Early forms of alcohol, people would leave something to ferment, and it would have a tiny amount of booze in it. People would drink it and get a bit merry and stuff, and it would be a real kind of probably a very solidifying thing socially and everything. But that was easy. But I can go down the corner shop and buy my own weight in alcohol for very little. Again, it's that potency and concentration that our little brains and all of our lovely reward centers we just can't cope with. It's like all this scrummy stuff. Same with food, right? So it's yeah, it's our we've got these wonderful things in modern society that means that we can do all this cool stuff, and I can go and buy a bottle of whiskey and a flagon of wine and stuff. But of course, it's it's not how our bodies are set up to deal with it, and that's when we get into trouble.
Is there any connection between the fact that I'm assuming here, but it was probably a good trait to have historically to be good at optimizing because optimizing built you a well or caused you to have some sort of life sustaining environment which pushed society forward. But now that we live in such a relatively comfortable, easy, and slowly evolving in those senses at least world, are we now focusing that exact same part of the human condition on optimizing for fast food, for drugs, for social media, for all of these issues that you speak about? Are they a symptom of the fact that we have always built and we have always pushed forward, and now we've almost hit a wall of useful developments, and so we just put our collective effort into less useful ones?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly, right? We have this strive, we have this ambition, and we have the ability to back it up. I mean, dangerous it's a dangerous combination, right? The desire to do it and the ability to follow through. And yeah, I guess I think that is one way that we can look at it. But of course, we also live now in a world that is it is we have like 9 billion people on the planet. I think we're approaching that, aren't we? That's the kind of the level that we're getting up to over the next few decades. We live in increasingly connected but seemingly disconnected ways, in increasingly complex ways, and maybe actually we lack the simplicity. Maybe that's the key word here of our earlier selves. We had a simpler life back then, even once we were developing agriculture and things, and developing sort of small settlements and doing all the cool stuff and building all those early buildings and stuff. It was simpler. Life was simpler, and perhaps that allowed people to have more time. We always talk about leisure time. A lot of people sort of falsely think that we've got more leisure time now, and we don't. I mean, when people follow hunter-gatherer societies, when people look back into the records of what we were doing before, we don't have more leisure time. Where we have less, and the leisure time we do have, we fill with stuff that isn't particularly leisurable, if that's a, if that's a word. So yeah, I think there's something in that. Yeah, but we've definitely lost a simplicity that I think. I mean, that's what a lot of people are trying to get back, right? Um, you get retreats where people are living. It's this kind of strange thing, isn't it? It's like the travel industry seems to have this duality where it's like extreme luxury and you're going to throw everything at it, and before you know it, you're on a party boat in the middle of nowhere doing God knows what. And then the alternative is that basically, yeah, we'll put you in a room and there'll be no one there, and you'll have like, a Hessian like mat to lie on, and it'll be amazing, and you can pay us loads of money. It's like, and I think that kind of reflects our sort of duality. And I think that's another thing that we struggle with, is that we want all the shiny things, right? But when we have them, it doesn't necessarily make us happy. So then we want the basic things, and we do that for a bit, and we're like, well, this is nice, but I miss my comfortable pillow and stuff. And then we end up back in the middle again, wanting the shiny things again. And we always seem to sort of buck backwards and forwards, and that never quite find the happy medium that we want to. But we still search for it, right? And I think, on the whole, of course, most people. I mean, I called the book Unfit for Purpose, but I think quite early on in the book, I sort of say, look, clearly one of our problems is that we're very fit for purpose. We're very good at what we do, but we're not always very happy about the way that we do it. And I think that is something we're going to have to learn to, I guess, learn to live with, but grow up about, and that's going to be part of our shifting society. But who knows? Maybe we're going to get hit by another revolution. It took us thousands of years to develop agriculture. Then it took us a fair few thousand years to develop sort of industry. Then it took only a few hundred years to develop information. These things are all telescoping down. So what will be the next? What will be the next revolution that will just sideswipe us off our track? Who knows?
So we're having this conversation right now in the context of what we're seeing on social media and what we're seeing in the news in Ukraine. Now, this episode isn't out for a few weeks, so hopefully what I'm about to say is redundant, right? Hopefully there has been at least some sort of solution to tone down the violence being used against Ukraine right now. But I want to pose to you a question that you ask in the book in the context of this conflict that the world is watching, and that is, are we evolved to be violent?
Well, this was a really interesting chapter to write, and quite a difficult chapter actually, and for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's a difficult topic, right, from a personal perspective, um, where all of us are capable of being violent. We're all of us physically capable of inflicting harm on others, and certainly when we were children, we did. I don't think there'll be a single child that hasn't done something to another child at some point, right? None of us are angels, but we come out of that, most of us, because of societal limits and also perhaps personal limits on what we do. But all of that gets horribly mixed up. So it becomes quite difficult to say that we are inherently violent, or that we are violent, because the reality is we're not. Most of the time, most of us go around not living in fear of violence or inflicting violence on others. That's not to say that some people don't live in constant fear of violence, and it's not to say that some people aren't constantly violent. Clearly, those two things are true. However, overall, most of us have found some kind of happy medium with the devil inside us that hold us back from being violent. So that's sort of one step side of it, but the other side is sort of, and that would be an evolutionary sort of perspective. And people talk about sort of different modules in the brain that control these things, and impulse control and so on. Because you're not going to live very long in any society if you're going around taking lumps out of each other, right? So there's always that. But of course, violence can solve problems. I mean, it can create problems, but if we sort of zoom back from kind of a more modern interpretation of doing it, if your neighbor's causing you an issue, well, if you kill your neighbor, the issue disappears, right? So if you take that to a sort of bigger extreme, if you're a society and the society next door is something you want and they're not willing to give it to you, or they're doing something that you don't like, if you remove that society, then you take over, and it's all rosy. So it's kind of easy to see how sort of inherently violent tendencies, or the ability and potential to do violence, let's look at it that way, could then become expressed within a group, and that is essentially the beginnings of the notion of war. And unfortunately, human history has been, beset with war. The last sort of 60 or 70 years in Europe have been unusual in the sense that it's been relatively peaceful. That certainly wasn't the case even in recent times, and we can see evidence from that throughout history, right? So the question then is, are we becoming less violent as a society? That's not through evolution, but are our society structures becoming better? And what was really interesting is that you can find very, very convincing and learned works that say, no, we're not. And you can find very convincing and learned works that say, yes, yes, we are. And then you can find equally convincing learned works that say, no, we're about the same. So and a lot of it depends on how you define it and how you measure it and how you look at it, and the fact that it's a complex thing. So are we becoming more violent or less violent? That is a question that's open to interpretation. Are we capable of violence? Quite clearly we are. Are we capable of constraining and confining that violence? Quite clearly we are. What we're seeing playing out in sort of Ukraine at the moment, I suppose, is an expression of state violence, which many people would argue is an expression of the violent tendencies of a single individual, which is interesting, because now you have people acting out violence and being allowed to act. War is basically state-sanctioned violence, right? If you want to go out and kill someone in everyday society, you will, if you get caught for it, be punished for it. It is not state-sanctioned. But during times of war, as long as you follow certain rules, which are in some cases written down, codes of conduct, then you are state-sanctioned to go and commit violence. So that is an interesting kind of aspect of the human psyche. But what we're seeing, of course, in Ukraine is not just an expression of violence, but what we're also seeing is the expression, I suppose, of our better part. So yeah, people are attacking Ukraine, and Russia's attacking Ukraine, and Ukraine is defending itself. And as a consequence of that, there is incredible violence. But what we're also seeing is incredible charity, incredible humanitarianism from across the world, incredible empathy, um, which I guess the hope is, and experience teaches us in the long term will win out. Wars don't go on forever. But in the short term, and that depends on how you want to measure it, that violent tendency, our ability to do violence, linked of course with our brains, because warfare is really a technological achievement more than anything else, allow huge amounts of suffering to be meted out to people on a seemingly minute by minute basis at the moment. So it is, yeah, it is difficult, and you've got this kind of state. Yeah, it's a sort of societal thing, but actually more than that, it's a state issue. So it becomes a political sort of boundary issue, which is something that we've totally created. Yeah, you don't see sort of that's not the way that the world is divided up like that. We've invented that way of doing things, and that then becomes an expression not of the people within that, in the case of sort of autocracies like Russia, but of individuals. And if those states are a reflection of those individuals, then what we have to say is that dictators are generally violent people, because dictatorships are usually associated with violence meted out either to their own people, usually as forms of state control, or to other people as forms of state expansion. So it's yeah, all of those things sort of lump in, but we can't we can't really blame evolution for that necessarily. I think actually what you see in sort of normal society, if you like, a well-functioning society, is our ability to be able to constrain and confine our violence, and we may have violent thoughts, right? But we very rarely, actually, in reality, very rarely convert them into actions. It's yeah, I would say, if anything, humans are surprisingly not violent given our tendencies. But when you look across the mammals, so violence is a trait in animals, and actually killing members of your own species. People often go, humans are the only animals that kill members of their own species. They're absolute cobblers, right? Complete twaddle. Big survey of the mammals. I think 44% of mammal families that were looked at showed violence and killing. I mean, extreme expressions of violence towards members of their own species. And the conclusion of that paper was the only reason why it wasn't higher was because people hadn't studied it in a load of other things, right? So it's not uncommon, but we are about 7 times more violent than you would expect when you look across the sort of evolutionary pattern and you look at close relatives and all of this. You'd go, okay, well, humans should be this violent. We're actually much more violent, and that, well, that was based on sort of evidence of kind of intraspecific killing, so murder essentially, and other forms of killing. But maybe that could well be linked to our very close societal benefits of violence in the past, and the technology. We're able to, one animal facing up to another animal and killing it can kill one animal, whereas one human being with a bomb or with a weapon, or with some form of technological support, can kill many more. So we do have the option, I suppose, of being more violent. But yeah, it's a very interesting question that will rumble on. I mean, I don't think we'll ever get. I don't think people will ever tire of discussing our evolutionary history and makeup in respect to violence, and then trying to link that through to society, and sort of coming up against brick walls with how far we can go.
Is part of the difficulty reconciling that answer the fact that there's almost a paradox here, right? Again, I'm assuming, but I assume that being good at violence is a plus point of evolutionary fitness, because if you're up against somebody who wants to kill you and you can kill them, well, then your genes are going to continue. But then also, evidently, we can't be that violent. We can't be that prone towards action because there are getting on for 9 billion of us. Is that almost the crux of the issue here, that there is this massive paradox that we seem to be good at violence but also good at resisting violence?
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. It's a complete sort of tumultuous duality, really, because there are undoubtedly times in our past where violence would have been a hugely beneficial trait. There are times in our present where the ability to be violent and to be able to take those actions brings benefit beyond sort of self-defense would be a good example, which keys into the kind of flight or fight response. And we are able to, we are people often sort of think of humans as being these weak and puny individuals with bad senses and stuff. We are incredible generalists, and we're very well put together. We're able to, and we can use weapons, and we can use our environment, and it gives us an ability to to be incredibly violent. There is an able-bodied person who is more or less, regular size and stuff can easily kill someone else, and that's what happens. But equally, other people can defend themselves. So yeah, there is this kind of duality between the fact we can and we have and we do, and the fact that most of us don't. And I think it's a much more interesting question to ask is not, are we more violent or why are we violent, but actually why are we not more violent, and why are we actually predominantly peaceful? And the reality is that we all do better. Society functions better. We have better lives. We function more. You can't function in a, no one's having quality of life if you're constantly, involved in warfare and violence and turmoil. It's not a pleasant place to be. Whereas the life that we can build ourselves by being peaceful and by getting along and cooperating is a much better place to be. It's a simplistic analysis, but basically that's where we are, isn't it?
So something that definitely surprised me, and I think surprised the world, is the willingness of everyday Ukrainians who maybe last week were, I don't know, a takeaway delivery driver, to suddenly find it within themselves to have the courage to become warriors of sorts, right? Out of nowhere, something has gone off within them because of the fight or flight mechanism that has turned them into completely willing and able fighters. And I was, especially on the first day of that, when I was watching these everyday people and trying to, through some weird empathy, imagine myself in that situation. I don't think, and I say this with the benefit of being in a non-war torn country in a nice office, but I don't think that I could do that. But is it correct to say that in the right circumstances, we are all evolved to almost have a power and an intent far beyond what we actually think we're capable of, just because we haven't been asked to call upon it?
I mean, quite potentially, yes, but we also have to think about what's actually happening, because at the moment I just saw a headline that came about an hour ago that more than 1 million people are fleeing Ukraine. Um, so yes, you're absolutely right. Some people are taking up arms and they are volunteering, and I mean, there was an interview with someone the other day on the radio who was, I think she was she ran a women's clothing shop, but she was now essentially a quartermaster, giving out weapons to whoever came up, and people were just wandering up on the streets and getting hold of guns. Those people wanted to defend their their homes and their country against an aggressor. However, at the same time, there were people who were cowering in basements, which is, the word cowering unfortunately has a pejorative term. I don't mean it that way. That is a that is a sensible way to behave in those situations. And there were other people who were getting into vehicles and driving towards the Polish border. Another sensible response. So I think we do tend to get sort of swayed a little bit, I think, by sort of what seem like more extreme and sort of, I guess, what we would perceive as more heroic responses. But actually protecting your family, removing yourself from the situation and doing what you tell is equally heroic in those situations. So it is a tricky one. But yeah, certainly some people have unleashed in them, have unlocked in them a hidden ability to be able to do those things. And that's an interesting aspect of the human psyche, but it's not universal. I don't think, as we can see in these situations, I don't think everybody is necessarily jumping into those situations to do that. Different people respond differently in different ways, depending on their personal situation as well. I would respond differently now with children than I would have done, say, 20 years ago without. It's those sorts of things that can be difficult for us, because we have, I suppose, it goes back to how we open the conversation, right? We have complex lives. We are complex beings in terms of our environments and our situations, and that all comes to play when the brown stuff hits the fan, which it has done.
So I might be here making a link that doesn't exist, but if there is a link here, you are the man to ask, right? So we've been seeing for the last few years headlines about the declining birth rate across the globe that seems to be this fairly universal thing. Now, given that evolutionary fitness is a measure of how likely we are to reproduce, is the fact that we are unfit for purpose playing any role whatsoever in the falling of the birth rate?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So you have to wonder what's driving the decline that we're seeing. So if that decline is being driven by some physical process, people are becoming less fertile, then we could be suggesting that maybe if that's being underdriven by a genetic effect, is that some evolutionary thing? Almost certainly not, but it's an interesting question to ask. Is it environmental? Have we created a society, for example, where we're eating in such a way that it reduces our sperm count or it stops ovulation? Possibly. There are certainly aspects of that. Obesity, which is rife, has knock-on effects to fertility and things. So we could make some sort of argument that we've made ourselves unfit for purpose in that respect. But actually, what we also see in the decline of birth rates is people making conscious decisions not to have children, because of the world, either because of the state of the world. So in other words, they don't want to bring more lives into the world because it's not a good place. They don't feel it's a good place to be. There's that argument which you see expressed quite frequently. But there's also the fact that people are having very interesting and fulfilled lives, then they don't feel the need to have children, particularly, I mean, at the time where they're able to have children. Whether or not they will feel that they've missed out when they're in their 50s or whatever, or 40s or whatever, is a different question. But they are taking the decision to not have children as a conscious decision because they don't feel they need them. They don't want the burden of them, or they don't want to change the way that they live. And having had children, I can see their point, right? So it seems like a valid point to me. So it's we get these different kind of effects, but yes, certainly if we've created societies where we've got access to so much food that we're becoming obese to the extent where we're declining, where we're becoming less fertile, or if we spend so long. I mean, there's the other thing is maybe people lack the opportunity to have children because they're not forming relationships in which they can have children, for example, because they spend too much time on Facebook or Twitter, or whatever else. Again, it's a bit of a stretch, right? But there's probably some aspect of that. I mean, I know people that will happily spend all weekend sat in front of gaming and stuff. They wouldn't, whereas they're not out meeting people that they might have children with. So I guess you could make those sorts of side arguments, but yeah, I mean, there are other arguments too, of course. So declining birth rate across the world is largely because we get lots of countries going through what's called the demographic transition, where countries go from populations go from having very high birth rates and very high death rates to then having lower death rates but still high birth rates. So you end up with population increases like we're seeing in East Africa, for example. And then you move through this demographic transition into having low birth rates and low death rates, which are caused by a mixture of medication, good medicine, and sort of developed society and family planning and education and so on. So we're seeing countries move through that demographic transition more. So we are seeing a slowing down of the birth rate, and in fact, if you look at predictions of sort of human population, we are reaching, hopefully reaching that plateau, which is good because of course we do live on a finite planet with finite resources that we're already well tanning quite hard, I think would be a reasonable way to put it. So we need to reduce our footprint on the earth, and we'll do that technologically, but we'll also do it by perhaps by being a bit fewer. But I don't think it's an interesting argument. I often have this with people where they'll talk about all the problems of the world. With my conservation scientist hat on, people go, all the problems of conservation are caused by too many people, and it's like, well, actually they're not. They're caused by too much consumption. It's the countries that you're talking about that are often areas that have lots of interesting wildlife and habitats are often quite sparsely populated. The problem is that one person there uses about 40 times the amount of resource than one person here. So I would say to people, if they want to go down that line, there's a simple answer, which is, well, you first. You can reduce the problem by one if that's what you want, or we need to address consumption. But yeah, but I'm getting off topic here. But yeah, so I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? If we've made ourselves through our modern society less able to have offspring for whatever reasons, whether it's because we've convinced ourselves we don't want to because we've created a world we don't like, or we've removed the opportunity from ourselves because we filled our lives with distractions that prevent us from doing what's needed, or if we've ended up medically unfit to have children, it's that would be the ultimate expression, I guess, of being unfit for purpose.
So to end, I want to ask you to make the prediction of all predictions as somebody in your position, which is that we've looked back a lot today, right? We've found the root causes of some of our behaviors and problems, but as we know, evolution takes a bloody long time to show its head. And so with everything we know about how we're potentially unprepared for the current world we live in, if you were to take a bet on the next significant trait which is evolved sufficiently to the point where it's detectable in human history at some point in the future, what do you think will next evolve to do or be?
Oh, right. Well, I think that is a tricky question. Probably most of the traits we'll be able to measure, I guess, may be negative in terms of not necessarily great. So we have such good medical support for so many different things now that characteristics which may have become may have not succeeded genetically will get a chance to because we can treat the effects of them and stuff. So we might well be seeing, I guess we could see more of that. I think what we'll see though, I don't think, you know, my prediction is not going to be a genetic or evolutionary prediction. I'm going to make a prediction that we're going to, over the next 20 or 30 years, I think the notion of taking care of ourselves, I think will go. It's already gone from being quite niche and fringe and a bit like, well, you don't want to be taking care of yourself. You know, what's wrong with you taking care of yourself? To kind of like, you know, now people are going, oh, maybe I should be taking care of my mental health a bit more. I think we are going to see, and we're already seeing, but I think we're going to really see it taking off in the next sort of few decades, that we take this stuff much more seriously, and that as a society we understand much more that happiness, you know, is not something that's some optional thing because you've worked 15 hours down the pit and now you're allowed to go to the pub for three minutes. You know, it should be it should be something we're aspiring to. We are an incredible species. We can achieve incredible things, but we don't do that if we're mired in misery. And I think what we might see is people taking that much more seriously and embedding it much more in society, that we take care of things like mental health. We accept and understand that these things are important, and we have societal structures in place to actually move us towards the situation where they're being sorted out. And we're not there yet. Let's be honest, we're not. And I think that will be our next big transition. Taking care of ourselves better. I hope so. You know, I hope so. But we'll see. There's not a lot of evidence for it right now, but you know, history is a long game, right? And like he said, evolution is a long game, right? Human history is a pretty long game too, and I think, yeah, it will be fascinating, but unlikely that we have this conversation in 100 years' time. But if we do, I hope that we'll be having it with a much more developed and mature society that's able to actually look after the people that are in it much better than we have done.
It's a positive place to end. Adam, I'm going to make sure that Unfit for Purpose is linked below in the show notes. If people want to go and find you elsewhere, I know that you tweet quite a bit, which I enjoy. Where else can people go and find you?
Yeah, so Adam Hart Science on Twitter. I do have an Instagram account. I'm not very good at using it, but it's Adam Hart Science. But I'm getting better at using it. I had a few people follow me over from Twitter who were lumping abuse on me, so I sort of ignored it for a bit. But I think that's disappeared now, so I'll start using that more. Other than that, yeah, I'm Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire. We teach all kinds of stuff: evolution, behaviour, animal biology, biology, and ecology, basically, but all kinds of other bits and pieces linked into my other interests, which range from, yeah, as I say, entomology to African conservation and ecology. So that's where you can find me most times. Yeah.
Amazing. Adam, thank you so much.